Excellent material to cover, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Thank you, everybody, for joining the Conservation Policy Crash Course. For those that are just still making their way in, you should see there's a poll question, a 3-question poll up for participants. We're just interested to learn more about folks' background and the areas of conservation law that they're most interested in, so we can help shape the discussion to the greatest extent possible. So as folks finish filling out the poll, just some quick housekeeping reminders. I would recommend that folks leave videos off and stay muted while we're in the big group here all together. I think that just helps Zoom to run more smoothly. And we will be using breakout rooms in which you'll be interacting with fellow participants in smaller settings, at which point feel free to turn your videos on so you can chat to each other as normally as possible. And yeah, we appreciate your patience in advance. I think this should go pretty smoothly, but as I'm sure everybody's aware, living under quarantine and working with Zoom and PowerPoint at the same time, there's sure to be some hiccups with that process. So in advance when those arrive, thank you for bearing with us. So I am going to go ahead and start by sharing my screen, and we're going to jump into the presentation. This is being recorded. I believe the conference is recording it for their purposes, and it should be publicly available after the conference wraps up. Excellent. Okay, if anyone cannot see the PowerPoint screen here, please use the chat to let us know. But assuming that everything is going well so far, we'll go ahead and get started. So I'm Mike Evans. I'm the Senior Conservation Data Scientist in the Center for Conservation Innovation at Defenders of Wildlife. And I am joined today by my 2 colleagues, and I'll let them introduce themselves.
I'm Andrew Carter. I'm a Senior Conservation Policy Analyst at CCI.
And I'm Jacob Malcolm. I'm the Director of the Center for Conservation Innovation at Defenders. I will go ahead and apologize ahead of time. As we will learn in just a little bit, there's some news relevant to this course that will be coming out in about 56 minutes. And so I may be popping in and out throughout the discussion. So apologies now for that.
Awesome. So yeah, we will be your co-hosts. We'll take turns sort of presenting the different materials. And as I mentioned, just to orient folks, the plan sort of outlined here is to intersperse us presenting material on various conservation policies, giving an opportunity for you all, the participants, to engage in some discussions around different questions that we've framed. And then we're also going to share some examples from our work at Defenders that help to illustrate kind of how science intersects with policy in practice. So to get started, thank you for those that filled out the poll. You should be able to see those results. And it looks like the vast majority of folks are from academia and have most experience with the ESA, Endangered Species Act. So that's very helpful. We're really targeting this workshop, I think, towards that exact slice. Folks that maybe have a scientific background and are wanting to figure out how they can use their knowledge and expertise to contribute to conservation policy. So with that said, for those that haven't heard of Defenders of Wildlife, we're a national nonprofit, and we're dedicated to the protection of all native plants and animals in their natural communities. And in doing this work, we work a lot with policy and the federal agencies that implement conservation policies. And the 3 of us, myself, Jacob, and Andrew, you heard work in the Center for Conservation Innovation, where we're specifically focused on finding intersections between science, technology, and policy. So we've done quite a bit at figuring out how we can use science to inform policy and improve conservation outcomes, which is the topic of our workshop today. So just to give a brief roadmap of where we're going, the goal here is really, we want at the end of this for participants to be able to identify different regulatory mechanisms and processes at which scientific data can be interjected basically to impact conservation policy outcomes. And so there's 5 main outcomes that we hope participants will be able to do when they walk away from this, all having to do with being able to identify and understand what agencies are implementing different federal laws, have an understanding of the policy creation process, and as I said, describe how scientific research and scientific information can be interjected into those policies and processes. And the way that we're going to do that is following this brief outline. It makes sense to start with probably the least amount of animal slides you're ever going to see in a conservation themes presentation, talking about legal principles and framework. It's an important starting point. And I promise we'll move into some species and habitat focused laws where there will be pictures of things like mountains and turtles and whatnot. Summarize those with sort of common strategies for improving and modifying those different laws. And then we want to spend a good chunk of time at the end of the workshop with a group activity in which you all will be thinking a little bit about how to formulate a research proposal or a research agenda that could be used to affect different conservation policy outcomes. And keep an eye out for the little scientist logo here. We try to use that as a key to highlight places on the different material we'll be presenting where science can be used and interjected in the different legal processes. So before we dive right in, are there any questions using the chat? Jacob and Andrew, I might rely on you to see if there are questions. All good? All right, let's do it then. So yeah, here's those non-animal themed framework slides, policies, laws, and regulations. So we wanted to start by presenting sort of the big picture framework of how conservation law derives its authority and is handed down in the US. So there's sort of a couple levels that arrange themselves in a hierarchy that are important to think about. Policies is a term that gets used in a couple different ways, but here we mean it to be sort of the big picture, like principles and courses of action that an agency or an administration aims to achieve. Laws are specific rules that are binding and enforceable by courts. They're one way that governments can achieve policy. And then regulations are non-legislative rules that are created by agencies and usually provide guidance or instructions as to how laws are carried out. And just something to note in other conversations, sometimes the term policy is applied to refer to regulations as well, but we're, for the purposes of this workshop, going to use regulations to mean the sort of lowest level of the hierarchy and policies as this big overarching principle. So as an example, I think it's helpful to illustrate a policy for protecting imperiled species in the United States that might be stated by an administration as we want to protect species from extinction. That's sort of our goal, our intention. The law that is used to achieve that is the Endangered Species Act, one of the laws. And so this comes with different powers that the government has to help achieve that policy. And then there are regulations, which could be the individual listing of species on the endangered species list. So how that law is being implemented and carried out. Okay, so yeah, thank you for letting me know my mic is going in and out. I will try to hold it closer to my mouth and speak clearly. So we can think about these principles being laid out in a hierarchy along sort of two axes. There's the level of authority and scope, and then there's sort of the ease with which a legal implement at one of these levels can be changed. So at the very highest level of authority, we have the Constitution, followed by laws, regulations, and guidance. And so an important principle to keep in mind here is that each component at a lower level of the authority hierarchy has to be consistent with the structure at the level above it. So guidance can provide guidance on how a regulation is carried out. A regulation must be consistent with a law, providing instruction on how that law is implemented. And all laws must be consistent with the US Constitution or state constitutions. And so similarly, there are increasingly...
Can I interrupt? Sorry, we're having some sound issues.
Okay.
Your mic seems to be going in and out.
That's not good. Andrew, do you want to try speaking and see if that's something clear? I'm not sure how to rectify that at the moment.
Can everybody hear me clearly? No cutout? Okay.
Okay. Andrew, you want to take over from here and we'll see how that goes?
You're muted now.
Sorry about that. As Mike noted, that you have this kind of hierarchy or a way of conceptualizing the different levels of how laws, rules are put into place. Each one must be consistent with the one above. A law has to be consistent with the Constitution. If it's not, a court will strike it down. A regulation must be consistent with the law. If it's not, a court will strike it down. The same for guidance. So do you want to move next slide, Mike? And we see also malleability. It's much easier to change guidance. A single solicitor working in a government agency can change it if they have the power, if they have that influence. Regulations are a little bit harder. The agencies have to go through the Administrative Procedures Act, and we'll be talking a little bit more about that in a bit. Laws are even harder. Majorities in the Senate and House signed by the president. If you look at the past several decades of environmental laws, a lot of them have not really changed that much in terms of the actual statute because it is so hard, because it is so politically contentious, and because the process is so involved. Finally, Constitution. Their Constitution has not changed that much in the past 200 plus years. It can be amended by a 2/3 vote in the Senate and the House, or by ratification of 3/4 of the state legislatures. It's usually amended by the Senate and the House. It's very hard to get 3/4 of the states to agree on anything. So at this point, we're going to break into discussion groups for a little while. And we'd like each group to kind of discuss this idea of how to define habitat. The Endangered Species Act, for example, does not have a statutory definition of habitat. That's led to a lot of major problems in how it's implemented. Has been the subject of lawsuits. There's a lot of debate about it. The Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service didn't, until possibly today, have a definition of habitat. So keeping in mind this idea of malleability versus authority, we wanted each group to kind of discuss, if you wanted to get a definition of habitat into the laws, how would you do it? What level of legal authority would you put it in? Constitution, law, regulation, guidance. And what are the benefits and drawbacks of that level? So what problems can you foresee in trying to get it put into that where you think it should go?
All right, so hopefully, I don't know if folks can hear me better. We're gonna send folks into breakout rooms, give you about 5 minutes to discuss, and then we'll reconvene and quickly share some thoughts from those discussions.
If you have any questions, use the chat, please.
Everybody has made it back. So I popped in with group one, and they had some good questions actually about defining habitat and this question in general. I'm curious, did others have questions about the legal hierarchy and how to think about where you might intervene as a scientist, or even not as a scientist, to try to provide something like a definition of what habitat is? No questions, huh? How about thoughts? I'm curious if anybody thought that amending the law was maybe an effective place to start. Okay, here we have a thought. So right, there's this issue of state versus federal laws in terms of which might be more feasible to affect. So that is a good question. There are state laws that provide different protections to species, some of which are equivalent or similarly structured to the ESA. Yeah, there's a state versus federal question. I think actually I would defer to either Jacob or Andrew to answer that. They have more experience with various state laws.
Sure, I can take it. And I will talk a little bit about what's going on later on. Because under the Constitution, they have what's called the Supremacy Clause. Federal law trumps state law. If there's any inconsistencies, go with federal law. For federal statutes that will use habitat in some kind of definition or make an analysis based on habitat, you really have to have kind of a nationwide definition. There's no way really to feasibly have different definitions for each state. That does not mean that states on their own, for their own laws, can't come up with a definition of habitat that applies to state environmental protection laws. The only thing is, if the states have been delegated authority or taking action under a federal law, they have to be more protective and as protective as the federal law. So if the federal government has a definition of habitat and the state definition includes less area, that would probably violate the preemption law, and you would go with the federal definition.
And so, yeah, thanks, Andrew. In addition to that state versus federal definition, I think, the concept that we wanted to illustrate with this exercise is basically one could envision including a definition of habitat in something like the ESA at either of those levels. You could try to amend the law, which would have the benefit of being harder to change in the future and more binding, because all subsequent regulations and actions by agencies would have to agree basically with that, how the law is defining habitat. The downside is it's a much harder process. There's a higher barrier to entry basically to get the law amended in the first place. And so often we need to think about sort of this balance between what is the feasibility of having some policy amended versus what is the impact and ease with which that might be reversed down the line. And those things sort of scale along that hierarchy that we laid out. And so this is actually something that we at Defenders have thought a little bit about, and I'll let Jacob describe a project that we initiated to do just this, define habitat under the ESA.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. And I was part of breakout group number 3, and we talked just a little bit about this because it is a hot topic this very day. So last year, or actually I guess it may have been 2018, the Supreme Court heard an ESA case, first time in a while that they had. And it was on the question of the dusky gopher frog. Do we have the slides up, or can you toss up that one?
Sure.
There's no really key material on this slide. I just like looking at pictures of dusky gopher frogs.
Yeah, there we go.
With the dusky gopher frog, there we go. The question at hand was, could the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service designate a certain area as critical habitat for the species? Critical habitat being essential for the conservation of a species. And an area that they designated was private property that the frogs can't use right at the moment, but with a little bit of restoration they could. And this, the Supreme Court's finding was not terribly long. And one of the key issues that came out of it was that for something to be critical habitat, it first needed to be habitat. And while critical habitat is defined under the ESA, habitat more generally is not. And so they basically kicked the decision back down, saying to the Departments of the Interior and Commerce, so the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and National Marine Fisheries Service, you all need to define habitat so that you can then make a decision about critical habitat for this adorable frog. We last year decided that we would take a swing at combining biology and policy and legal analyses all together to propose a definition on our own. So before they came out with a definition, what would a good definition look like that we believe meets the purpose of the Endangered Species Act? And put that together, and then on July 1st of this year, it was published in Environmental Law Reporter. And in approximately 30 minutes, there should be a press conference with Fish and Wildlife Service and National Marine Fisheries Service offering a definition of critical habitat. I'm sorry, of habitat more broadly. And we got an early version of just the definition itself. And unfortunately, the definition that we got from the service, the proposed definition, isn't particularly helpful. Our definition of habitat includes habitat is the area or type of site where a species naturally occurs or that it depends on directly or indirectly to carry out life processes, or where a species formerly occurred or has the potential to occur and carry out its life processes in the foreseeable future. Now, I think everybody here who is a biologist will find that to be a somewhat contorted definition. It's not what we think of as biologists as what habitat really is. But it does meet some requirements that the definition of critical habitat have in the statute. The definition that the Fish and Wildlife Service and National Marine Fisheries Service are going to propose in 29 minutes includes the phrase, habitat includes areas with existing attributes that have the capacity to support individuals of the species. And that's a huge difference. That's basically saying habitat is only, well, it looks like habitat is only the areas that already have the attributes to support the species. So that would exclude areas like what this dusky gopher frog needs, which is just a little bit of restoration. According to this definition, it already has the existing attributes. It would also exclude areas from future change under climate change. So it's going to be really interesting to see where this all plays out. We're going to talk about scientist engagement with the rulemaking process as we go along here. And there may be opportunities, and you all may have a desire to put your knowledge to work in shaping this. We'll talk about how you go through, how you participate in public comments, and how you can, oh, I see a chat. Sorry, I missed. Okay, Andrew's taking care of that. How you can weigh in on the definition of habitat.
Jacob, just to clarify that this definition was offered as part of a regulation, correct? rulemaking?
Correct. Correct. It is a formal rulemaking. As is typical for this administration, they have made the comment period as short as possible, allowing only 30 days for comment.
So we're not changing the law, it's providing clarification on the law on that regulatory level, right?
Correct. And that comment window is in fact governed or is largely prescribed by the Administrative Procedures Act, something that I know may make some of you want to claw your eyes out as you think about administrative procedures, but as Andrew or Mike, who's next up?
I'll take care of
Andrew's
it.
going to take it? Okay. Andrew's going to explain just how really important the APA is.
So yeah, admittedly, administrative law can make people, both scientists and lawyers, claw their eyes out, but it's extremely important. And the Administrative Procedure Act is going to be a law that doesn't just apply to environmental regulations or conservation agreements, conservation regulations. It applies across all situations where the federal government where Congress has delegated some kind of rulemaking authority to federal agencies. So the APA was developed back in the 1940s when you had this kind of big rise of powerful federal bureaucracies. And there was a lot of resistance in Congress to the idea of unelected bureaucrats making important decisions. So the APA was kind of a balance, a compromise that set limits on how federal agencies can pass regulations. There's a lot of requirements. 3 of the big ones, when they want to do a rule, Ranger rules have to be proposed, offered in draft format, or the information that's going to be in the proposed rule put out there. Interested persons, citizens, organizations, individuals can have an opportunity to participate, to say what they think of the law or the proposed regulation, to criticize it, to support it, to argue that it should be changed. And finally, courts can overrule arbitrary and capricious decisions. And those words, arbitrary and capricious, are in the law. So the federal rulemaking process is long, it is super complex, and it is often confusing. What we have here is, believe it or not, a simplified flowchart. I'm not going to go through each item, but this is kind of how you end up at the end with a specific regulation governing something like the Endangered Species Act. There's an initiating event up on the right-hand corner with a little scientist icon here. That's just some kind of event that leads Congress to take some kind of action. So when Congress passed the big insecticide law in the early 70s, that was driven by, in many, largely Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, and the public awareness that insecticides, pesticides could cause serious ecological harm. The public rose up, demanded legislation, Congress followed suit. That initiating event could even be scientific research that just comes out that shows that there's some urgent problem that current laws do not adequately address. So Congress passes the law, frequently with complicated laws involving scientific subjects, environmental subjects. They delegate authority to agencies to pass individual rules to kind of implement that law. In terms of the Endangered Species Act, Congress is not going to, every time a species needs to be listed, write a law to list the species. What they do is they delegate that authority to the Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service, or the Department of Interior and the Department of Commerce. So let's say Fish and Wildlife Service wants to pass some kind of rule, listing a species or defining critical habitat. Like I said, under the APA, they have to develop a draft proposed rule for those rules that have to be open for public comments. They have internal review. They have some interagency review where other agencies in the White House who deal with management and budget take a look at it, give their critique, send it back to the agency. Eventually, you get a publication. The proposed rule is published in what's called the Federal Register, the main publishing arm of the federal government. It's open for public comments. At that point, scientists are very helpful if the proposed rule is based on some scientific rationale, if the law requires some form of science to be used in coming up with that kind of rule. The agencies have to, they don't have to follow the comments, they don't have to do what they're requested, they do have to adequately address them. They have to look at what's said, they have to consider whether that does change what they were going to do. And they have to eventually, when they publish a final proposed rule, a final rule, address these comments there. That means a lot of final rules are very long because they'll go through each category of comment or each comment and explain why they're either following it or not following it, or whether it's relevant or not. It's published, again, in the Federal Register, and it takes effect. That's not necessarily the end. There's two ways to overturn that rule. One, what's called the Congressional Review Act. Both houses of Congress can pass a resolution striking down the rule. There's streamlined procedures to do that they don't have to follow the normal legislative process under their own rules. Alternately, and this is very common, there can be a legal challenge against the rule. In many cases, groups will sue, arguing that the rule is inconsistent with the law or the Constitution, or that it did, when they developed the rule, they didn't follow the requirements of the Administrative Procedure Act. So the Federal Register, like I said, is the official publishing arm of the executive branch. It used to be row after row of printed books. It still probably is somewhere, but just about everybody uses the electronic online version. In here, you will find anything that the government had to publish and published. If you are interested in a certain species or habitat or area, you can set alerts so when a proposed rule is published impacting that species or that area, it'll send you an email. It's very useful if you want to follow along with certain policy issues. The parallel companion site to the Federal Register is what's called regulations.gov. It's where all these documents produced during the rulemaking process, and there are usually a lot, get put up for public access. So whatever goes into the Federal Register also goes up on regulations.gov, but you also get a lot of the public comments that have been submitted, not necessarily all of them if they were submitted in print form. And you also get supplemental information, reports, things that the agency is considering when developing those regulations. It also allows electronic submission of the comments on the current rulemaking. If you want to comment on a proposed rule, that's the best place to go. So I mentioned before about this idea that if a court finds that an agency action is arbitrary and capricious, it can strike it down. It happens a lot. It is one of the main ways that organizations like Defenders or industry organizations try to challenge environmental and conservation rules and regulations that we think are inconsistent with the law, or where we think that the way they were developed is just arbitrary and capricious. It's not logical. Next slide, please. And examples could be, they didn't just follow requirements of the APA, they didn't put it up for sufficient public comment, they ignored comments, they didn't address them. There was no legitimate logic or rationale for the action taken. They just put into place something, they didn't really explain why. And in a lot of cases, the agency didn't incorporate what they were legally required to do when making that regulation. Under the Endangered Species Act, to list a species, and we'll talk about this later, you have to use best available science. If the agency doesn't use the best available science in deciding not to list the species, you can sue over that. Next slide, please. And we've seen that a lot over the past couple of years. The Trump administration has been very eager to overturn or reverse or amend or put up environmental regulations more in line with the administration's philosophy about environmental regulations. However, they, in their eagerness to change things, they often haven't been found by courts not to have followed the APA. They ram things through, they don't offer sufficient avenue for, they don't offer opportunity for public comment. They're ignoring science. They're doing things too fast and too recklessly. And that's what the court's been saying. So, oh, Mike, do you want to take over?
So, yeah, we're going to switch gears here and talk about specific environmental laws in a moment, but I think it's worth just pausing and summarizing. You know, we spent a decent amount of time on the APA Administrative Procedures Act, which isn't something I know that I, coming from a biology background, typically thought about in the realm of conservation policy, but as I think Andrew was explaining, it really sets the stage for a lot of the mechanisms by which regulations get propagated, regulations that affect conservation implementation, and also provides a lot of the mechanisms by which scientists and others can challenge or try to amend some of those regulations. So it is kind of the nitty-gritty of how a lot of conservation policy works. So this is probably a good opportunity to check in as we are about to shift gears. Were there any questions regarding APA substance or procedures for Andrew?
Has anybody here ever been involved with the Administrative Procedures Act, commented on a federal regulation, or been asked to serve as an expert witness, say, in a hearing having to do with an APA violation?
This is Erin Jacob. I'm in Canada. I haven't about the APA, but have in other Canadian federal legislation, like for to be a witness and to comment on it. Being a witness was very scary going into it. Afterwards, not as scary as I thought it would be. I would totally do it again. But yeah, probably one of the scariest things I've done since PhD defense.
That's awesome.
Good to know for the rest of us that it wasn't as horrible an experience as one might imagine.
Partly because there's people out there willing to talk about their experiences. I certainly looked at your website and relied on a network of people.
Cool. That's a very good point. We're talking about APA here, but there are also many state statutes that have similar roles in the public discourse and public involvement. Anybody been involved in state level regulatory processes like this? By a show of hands, how many people are now looking forward to testifying on something? Oh, we got one thumbs up.
Yeah, one thumbs up. That's good. Oh, we have someone sharing that they testified on the local level. Hannah?
Cool.
Yeah. So yeah, we'll touch on the role of testimony in these different processes, I think, a little bit later on. But definitely can be an impactful way for scientists and others to contribute. Well, thank you for those of you, yeah, sharing those experiences. That's exciting and interesting to hear that there's some of you have been in the weeds, so to speak, with these various processes. So, as I said, we're going to dive into some more specific environmental laws at this point, and just want to recognize that in thinking about sort of the scope of all things environmental, to me, it makes sense to kind of divide things into two categories: pollution control laws, which include things like the Clean Air, Clean Water Act, that are more focused on regulating the activities or emissions discharges of the human enterprise. But we are going to focus our discussion on natural resource management laws. So these are laws that directly regulate things pertaining to species and places, basically. And so, yeah, just to to recognize, as we have in this conversation so far, that we are going to focus mostly for the rest of the workshop on federal laws, but that there are often state and sometimes local parallels to the federal laws, especially things like the Endangered Species Act. And that there is, as we mentioned before, a hierarchy and supremacy of federal to state to local. And do you have anything to add for this slide?
No, not particularly. Just to note that, yeah, a lot of times we have similar rulemaking processes at the state level as well, where you have proposed rule, you have public notice and comments, and you get a final rule. And a lot of those can be extremely important, especially in areas where the state is making a decision about, really critical habitat or things that may impact listed species.
Yeah, that's a great point that we mentioned, using the Federal Register as a resource to keep an eye on or receive alerts about federal actions related to if there's a species or location of interest, that states also have some authority over those species and places. And so it's probably also worth keeping an eye on some of those procedures and regulations. So we've narrowed our scope here to natural resources or conservation related laws. And just to kind of structure what we're going to be talking about, those fall into two categories in our minds. Those that are species focused. We've been talking a lot about the Endangered Species Act, but there's also several other federal US laws that provide protections and regulations that are specific to species or groups of species. And we'll touch on one of those. Then there are also what we'll call habitat focused laws that I think just sort of colloquially are perhaps less familiar to folks. I don't think that FLTMA, the Federal Land Policy Management Act, or NIFMA, the National Forest Management Act, were very high in that initial poll that I sent out, and that's totally expected. But these laws regulate how sort of lands are managed, broadly speaking. And so also you can imagine have implications for species conservation. And before we dive into either of those, this is a bit of a bait and switch on our part, but there is a really important overarching environmental law, NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, that is cross-cutting across both of those domains. And so it's worth spending a bit of time outlining because it does touch on both species-specific and habitat-specific laws.
So I'll take over here. I noticed that a lot of people said they wanted to learn about the ESA, but also a fair number wanted to talk about NEPA. So we'll spend a little bit of time going to a little bit of detail. So I mentioned this, there were a lot of kind of major environmental laws, conservation laws in the 1970s. They were predated by the National Environmental Policy Act and the creation of the Council on Environmental Quality in 1970. National Environmental Policy Act, frequently referred to as NEPA, covers all major federal actions significantly affecting the quality of the human environment. This does not just mean things involving environmental laws or forests or national parks. It means everything. Every federal agency has to comply with the requirements of NEPA. If the Federal Aviation Administration is considering a rule that would, for example, allow more planes to pollute more, just to make up an example, they would have to go through this NEPA analysis. We'll go through each stage of it, just to note that, so under NEPA, federal agencies have to examine the environmental impact of the proposed action, describe the adverse environmental effects, and they have to offer alternatives. Usually one alternative is not do the action, or do the part of the action, or do the action but scale it back. And one very important part about NEPA is that it is procedural rather than substantive. What that means is NEPA doesn't require you to make certain decisions. It just requires you to do this analysis. It is, in theory, an agency could say, this action we're about to do will destroy the environment, it'll kill a lot of these animals, it will pollute horribly, and there's not much economic benefit. They could still do the action. They would comply with NEPA if they just did the analysis. In practice, it doesn't really work that way. This mere act of doing this analysis often gets agencies to watch what they do to try to minimize their adverse impacts on the environment. So I'm going to go through this. I guess I'm going to go through this a little briefly. It is a really pretty complicated process. You have the proposed action, the agency carrying out the action, and this could be the agency building something for itself. It could be issuing a permit to do something else. Is it going to have significant impact on the environment? If not, if it's kind of an everyday thing that doesn't really have much impact, it can be classified as what's called a categorical exclusion. So these are just actions that agencies do a lot. They know that they're not going to have too much of an adverse impact on the environment. So they have a list of them and they're just going to check the list, move forward. To use a completely mundane example, the U.S. Forest Service has a categorical exclusion for repaving their parking lots. Otherwise, if they didn't have it, they would have to do this analysis every time they're going to repave their parking lots. So a lot of these categorical exclusions relate to things like that, just everyday activities that won't do too much. They still require some paperwork at the end. If an agency isn't sure whether there's going to be a significant impact, if they might, but they're not positive, they do what's called an environmental assessment. That's kind of a preliminary analysis of the issue. Begin investigating, in other words. If after that investigation, there is no significant impact, they'll issue what's called a finding of no significant impact. But if they do find that there's significant impact, then they go through this full NEPA process, which is a lot longer and which offers a lot more opportunity for public comments. So they do a notice of intent and scoping. They let people know they're going to do this NEPA analysis. People can already start submitting comments, critiques, offer scientific evidence about why this action should not be done or why it should be modified to be done in a more environmentally friendly manner. They issue a draft EIS. These are often enormous, thousands of pages in some cases. They get public comment on those. Then it goes to a final environmental impact statement. And based on that, they issue what's called a record of decision. And that just says what they're going to do, that they've done this analysis. Their final decision is to, say, carry out the act anyway. Like I said, since NEPA is procedural, not substantive, they just have to do the analysis and they fulfill their duty.
Hey, Andrew.
Yes?
Just really quickly, I wanted to note that there is a paper that should be coming out pretty soon analyzing NEPA actions that have been covered by NEPA over the past almost decade. And one of the really interesting findings is just the tiny, tiny, tiny proportion of federal actions that have to go down that EIS route. Most federal actions do not need a full EIS. A lot go through CADX over there on the left, or an EA, which is simpler. It's a very tiny proportion. Another really interesting finding was that there's a strong correlation between the amount of time an agency spends on an EIS and whether or not that action is stopped in court. So if they spend more time on it, the action is less likely to be stopped by a court because they've done a good job going through the analysis and involving all parties who should be part of the decision-making process. NEPA gets held up as slowing things down a lot of the time. And from my time when I was with Fish and Wildlife Service years ago, I remember running into this and feeling like it was so slow. But it is like Andrew said, a procedural law, and it is, when it's done right and when you go through it, there's a good reason to have it in place. It helps outcomes be better. I will look to see if that paper is published yet. I got a pre-publication version last week, so I'm not sure if it's actually out yet, but we can follow up with everyone here.
I have a
And
question. Oh,
I was just going to say, and I'm going to pop off for just a little bit right after if I need to answer this question, because the services have posted their definition of habitat. So I need to read this rule real quickly to see what's there. What's your question?
I was just wondering to what extent, I guess, an action is like broken into pieces to go through NEPA versus like, I guess like how, like what's considered an action, I suppose. Like a single action, or what, or how, to what extent things are like broken into parts. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. You want to take that, Jacob, or do you want me to?
Now, if you could, just differentiating individual actions, programmatic EISs as part of the process, et cetera.
Sure. Yeah, so the answer, you know, as in most areas of the law, is it depends. Obviously, agencies might want to do everything at once, so they just have to do that NEPA process once. But a lot of times it's helpful to do what's called a programmatic EIS, where if, say, an agency knows it's going to be analyzing a certain action done at different areas of the country, they do that first programmatic EIS, they look at it as a whole, and then they'll still have to do those individual EISs, but they should be much more quickly done because they have this programmatic one. In terms of just EISs for projects, it's really just varies. Usually, trying to think of a good way to put it, you're going to find different answers in different, where you look at different actions. Sometimes an action, let's say an engineering project, building a dike or something, will just be one EIS. Sometimes if they're doing it over a few years with different stages and these stages keep changing, they might have different EISs for each one. Sometimes they'll have one big EIS, then they'll file, they'll create an amended EIS to capture like new information. It just varies a lot.
I was going to add, Andrew, one of the impressions I've gotten about the EIS process and some other like parallel processes is there's kind of a balancing act that agencies need to undertake, because on the one hand, there's an incentive to not break down like a project into all sorts of small components to do an EIS on each of those, because that there's a lot of time and effort. On the other hand, if an agency tries to subsume too many different activities into one project and do a single EIS, then that is likely subject to challenge in court from folks saying that there's no way you could have done a sufficient enough job analyzing the impacts of this huge scope of work. So yeah, just to add that I think consistent with what you're saying, agencies have some latitude to define their own projects, and part of their calculus is probably weighing that trade-off.
Oh, absolutely. And that also reminds me that you are worried that you're going to get sued over a project that's going to impact the environment. Breaking it up into individual EISs for different stages also lets you get, if you get one through, you can continue on that stage of the project. If the whole EIS is challenged in court and it's delayed or struck down, then you have to start the whole project from scratch usually. So yeah, there's definitely a trade-off and strategic decision-making on the part of agencies to figure out how to get where they have to be without, triggering a lawsuit.
Thanks.
We're going to be discussing an example here, I think, in a couple slides related to this. So it's a good primer for that topic.
So these are the federal conservation laws that we've shown before. We're just going to show a quick kind of conceptual schematic of how NEPA and APA work with that. NEPA applies to all of them. If you were doing analyses under the Endangered Species Act, you might trigger a NEPA rulemaking process. You might have to do a NEPA analysis. But you also have to do whatever analysis you were doing under the Endangered Species Act. So you'll have, and we'll get more into detail on the Endangered Species Act a little bit later, but you'll have, say, a consultation document, and then you'll have a NEPA document, an EIS. And they actually, sometimes contain the same information, sometimes they're combined into one document, but you have to go through both processes. And then over both NEPA and these conservation laws is the APA. APA applies to everything, including NEPA, including to each of these laws. and applies to all federal agencies and agency decision making. Okay.
Cool. Oh, looks like our slide got cut off here.
Yeah. Didn't look like it.
Yeah, what we wanted to discuss was sort of a real life example actually that gets at, I think, the question that was raised of what constitutes a project, how does NEPA come into play, and taking it a step further, how could a conservation scientist or someone who is interested in promoting conservation engage with that process. So I will edit this slide in a moment, but the scenario is basically, we haven't covered any agency specific rules yet, so this is all through the lens of NEPA. The Forest Service is proposing a big logging project in a national forest. So what we want folks to think about is how does NEPA intersect with that action? And sort of what do you think the Forest Service would need to do under NEPA? And then, given that they do that, what might a conservationist be able to do to challenge if that decision, if you thought it was, not either based in sound science or going to be really detrimental to wildlife and habitats? So again, just to review the scenario, we've got Forest Service wants to do some logging in a national forest. How does NEPA basically play into that process? And how could a conservationist use the procedures under NEPA to make sure that good measures were being taken to protect habitat and species? Is that scenario clear? Yep, I can type them in the chat. That's a good idea. Yeah, it looks like Aaron. Yep, perfect. So yeah, Aaron shared the scenario in the chat. Yeah, we will actually discuss this, I think, just as a group. We were thinking about doing breakout groups, but I'm curious if while we're all here, do folks have questions about the scenario or the process? Or let's start with the first question. So how does NEPA play into the process of the Forest Service wanting to log a national forest?
I guess just that it's an action that they would need to put together an environmental impact statement for prior to beginning that action.
Yeah, exactly. It's an action that presumably has some effect on the environment, so they have to analyze it.
They might not have to go to an EIS right away. They might have to say, well, what kind of logging are we considering allowing? If it's, an acre, it might not need a full EIS. It might be an EA.
Gotcha.
Other hand, if it's like across the whole landscape, changing logging practices, then yeah, you might have to do an EIS.
And sorry, just for the scenario, this is something that's consistent with their existing forest plan. So it's not like they've identified this as a zone for logging within the national forest.
Yeah, we're just from a NEPA perspective.
Yeah, we'll assume it's consistent with all the other regulations that they have to comply with.
Feel free to put in the chat box or speak up.
I mean, I don't know a ton about the American context, but I guess first things I'd want to look at are what are the species at risk within that have habitat within that forest or where it forms part of their range, and how a reduction in that or a change would affect those individual species. So not just the forest by itself, but how it fits into the broader context. Although I don't know if that's outside of the bounds, like how much does the broader landscape fit in?
That is exactly what NEPA should be looking at.
So yeah, how would it affect other jurisdictions, like something that's the neighboring state park that's now not going to have whatever species, or the water, maybe this is the catchment area for downstream town. How does the municipality feel about that?
Exactly. And that's raises a good point I might not have emphasized before. NEPA is a very, when it looks at the human environment, it looks at the human environment, and that's a very broad look. So it could even incorporate things like human health. It goes beyond, say, the Endangered Species Act or the National Forest Management Act. It looks at all aspects of the environment and its relationship with humans.
So we want to look to see where we've hit on sort of what species are going to be affected, maybe some downstream or synergistic effects of the action, other things that as a conservationist or a biologist, one would want to make sure is seen in that NEPA analysis. So we've got a response in the chat. Some ESAs cover things like aesthetic impacts on the landscape, miles of roads to be constructed, impact on human recreations in the forest. Yeah, so this is I think summarizing another important point, that you want the assessment to basically accurately and in sufficient detail describe the extent of its impacts. So being precise and specific about where they're going to log, how much they're going to log, what the time frame in the scenario of those different cuts are going to be. The analysis to be, I think, sufficient from a conservation perspective needs to cover things, those details.
Oh, by the way, also, Rachel had a question about, since the government organization, do they do it themselves or have an outside consultant? Both. The government agency is ultimately responsible for the EIS. In a lot of cases, they'll get an outside contractor to do it. Sometimes to accelerate the project to make sure it gets done quickly, the applicants for a permit, say a private industry, might also hire the consultant to do the NEPA analysis and hand it over to the government, and the government can approve it or not. Very good question.
So this raises the question, thanks for those thoughts and questions too. This raises the question of, if we see, let's say the Forest Service did this and someone like, Defenders of Wildlife found their environmental impact statement analysis to be lacking. And this is exactly the case that we found ourselves in a year ago. So this is a real example, and I think for me it helps illustrate how, as a scientist, we can actually do analyses and use data to interject in these processes. So through tracking the Federal Register, we knew that the Forest Service was announcing that they were about to complete or draft a environmental impact statement on what they were calling the Prince of Wales Landscape Level Analysis Project. And that is a fun way of saying that they were planning on opening up Prince of Wales Island in the Tongass National Forest in Southeast Alaska to, I think, one of the largest proposed timber sales in like decades. And
Cleaning that toilet. I love you, sweetie.
is that a comment for us? Or?
At my desk. Thank you, sweetie.
I think someone may be off of mute and yeah, interacting with this little one.
Jennifer, you're off mute.
Yeah. Thank you. So one of the things that we could do as scientists is a remote sensing analysis, where we're looking at satellite imagery here and able to quantify in years past exactly how much was logged and when. And so those are the multicolored dots that you're seeing. In this app that we developed, we're able to pretty quickly, using satellite imagery, quantify year over year how much forest was already logged on Prince of Wales Island. And basically the purpose here was to demonstrate that we found the information in the EIS to be wholly insufficient for making a judgment about the impacts of the proposed logging decision. So again, to hit at Andrew's point earlier, because NEPA is procedural and not substantive, basically what we wanted to demonstrate was they did not adequately go through the level of analysis they needed to be able to accurately describe the impacts. We're not saying whether the impacts are good or bad. NEPA doesn't necessarily have any say in that matter. But if you're able to provide some sort of analysis that demonstrates, yeah, the agency totally just mailed this in, or didn't consider a really important piece of information, in this case, the historical levels of logging, then that decision, that EIS can be invalidated. And that's exactly what happened. Basically, a group of conservation organizations brought information like this to a federal court challenging the rule under NEPA. And through a series of federal decisions, it was most recently invalidated. So I think they now have to go back and start from scratch in the environmental, the EIS NEPA process again, is where we're at. So we like to highlight this example, not only because it sort of shows the nuances of how science can be used to inform NEPA, but it's also, in a field that can often be filled with sad news. It was a kind of a win for conservationists in science. We have a question from Tessa. What stage can the EIS be invalidated? That's a good one. And yeah.
Yeah, it would typically be when the final EIS is issued. If the draft EIS is out, the agency still hasn't made a final decision. They can't really be challenged yet.
But you can, members of the public can provide comments on draft EISs, is that correct?
Yes.
So at the draft stage, if you had this analysis in hand, you could provide that to the agency and say, hey, we have this data, we have this analysis that we think you should consider. And that would give them an opportunity to perhaps change course before publishing the final EIS. But then once it's published, then it is open for challenge in court.
Right, and a lot of courts have held that if you want to challenge it, you have to comment ahead of time. You can't wait till it's finalized and then launch your challenge. So you want to get every possible comment you can into the draft at the draft portion. Also note that Aaron talked about indigenous groups and treaty rights. Very good suggestions about how to engage with NEPA. Yes, since NEPA is so broad, since it looks at the human environment, yeah, indigenous rights should be analyzed underneath it.
That's actually, yeah, that's a good point on something. Thank you for the reminder, Aaron. We had wanted to highlight the sort of equity and environmental justice component that is implicit, if not explicit, to NEPA, because it is fairly broad reaching in its language, including effects to the human environment. That there's an opportunity, I think, given current social climates, and I know things that organizations like Defenders are thinking about in terms of incorporating environmental justice into our work, NEPA may play a prominent role in some of those analyses and discussions.
Also, to sort of note, I didn't look at the details because we can only get so much into a 3-hour talk. There is no, unfortunately, general environmental justice statute in the United States. There is an executive order that was issued during the Clinton administration that requires agencies to look at environmental justice when making these decisions. As an executive order, it is binding on the agencies until it's removed, but it's not really, you're not really able to challenge that in court if you need to, because it's an executive order.
One last question on NEPA. Christine raised a really good question that environmental impact statement public comments are sort of inherently more accessible to those with means, such as folks that can check the Federal Register using the computer, the internet. And so this obviously biases who gets to weigh in on those processes. And the question is, are there any current initiatives to kind of make the NEPA process more accessible to the public and maybe to some less advantaged communities? I'm not aware of any off the top of my head.
Well, a lot of nonprofits, NGOs with environmental focus will put together kind of letters, comments that then people can sign on to. They don't have to know that much about the subject of the letter, but they can put their name down. So say the Sierra Club might give under a NEPA comment, You know, here are 10,000 people who are against this, think that this EIS is insufficient. Other than that, I'm not aware of any kind of public comment initiatives to give people more access. I think there should be. I think it's a good idea. And unfortunately, when you get a petition with 10,000 signatures, the agencies will consider it, but they don't usually give it as much weight as individual specific substantive analyses. We also had a question a few questions. The EIS can no longer be validated after there's a record of decision. That's a good question. I believe it can, but I'll have to look into that. We also had a question about the executive order. I'll put that link in the chat window. Just pull it up quickly.
I just wanted to note really quickly, I popped back in for a second to see where everybody was, and wanted to note on the EJ front, we do have hope for legislative relief in this area coming down the road. So even though it is discouraging at the moment and there isn't much that's very strong that can be done, bills in both the House and introduced really recently, was it yesterday, Andrew?
Oh, the Environmental Justice Act.
From Harris? It
might have been the day before.
So yeah, Senator Harris introducing an environmental justice companion bill in the Senate. So we will watch and see how these evolve.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Jacob.
And I'm sorry, I completely blanked out. Yeah, record of decision is what you appeal. So yeah, you can appeal after it's been issued. And I put the executive order link into the chat.
Great. So I'm going to suggest we've got the ESA promises to be perhaps our most substantive area of discussion. So unless there are any other burning questions about NEPA, we'll also have time, I think, at the end of the workshop to discuss some of these things if folks keep NEPA questions in mind. But I want to make sure we get into the meat of the Endangered Species Act because there's a lot to discuss there. It's something that we work pretty closely with at Defenders and at CCI, and it sounded like it was one of the areas of primary interest and engagement just based on the entry poll that folks took.
Okay, I think I am up. So the Endangered Species Act was created in the 1970s. It was created to conserve species at risk of extinction and conserve their habitats. It is quite possibly, arguably, the strongest species conservation law in the world. The next slide, please. So there's a lot of provisions in the ESA. Some of them aren't that important. Some of them are major, but we're not going to get into too much detail. But we're going to look at 4 sections that are of particular interest to us, particularly important, and offer opportunities for scientific input. First is the listing. Section 4 allows agencies, it requires the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, National Marine Fisheries Service to designate species at risk as endangered or threatened. Once they receive that protection, they're protected from what is called take. Take can mean kill, it can mean harass, it can mean harm, it can mean disrupt their life cycle, disrupt their breeding, stress them, things like that. So it's a really strong protection because you can be liable under the ESA even if you're not physically harming or killing a protected species. Section 7 of the ESA requires federal agencies to use their powers to promote conservation and protect listed species. One of the provisions of this that's particularly important is it requires them to consult with the service. And by service, I mean either Fish and Wildlife Service or National Marine Fisheries Service, depending on the species, whether it's terrestrial, freshwater, or marine. if their actions are going to impact protected species. And because these take prohibitions are so strict, the Congress put in provisions to allow the service to issue permits. So in certain circumstances, you can take a species, and we'll go through a few of those. Main categories of species: endangered or threatened. Endangered are under threat of extinction in all or significant portion of their range. Threatened means they're expected to become endangered in the foreseeable future. So go back one second. And one issue that we deal with is the fact that the ESA does not define some important terms like significant portion of its range or foreseeable future. So that leads to a lot of legal battles and regulatory battles. So how do you get a species listed? The relevant service can decide on its own that it's appropriate to list the species as threatened or endangered. It is very rare. They have enough work. They don't do this on their own generally. However, the ESA does allow individuals to petition for the service to list certain species. Obviously, this is a great opportunity. If you work on a species, you know that it is threatened or endangered and you want it to be listed, you can file a petition yourself. If you file a petition, the Fish and Wildlife Service has 3 months to determine if there's substantial evidence that the listing may be needed. They don't do a full analysis, but they kind of look into the research, and you're expected to kind of set forth your argument in your petition. And they say either, all right, you know what, this isn't justified. We know this species is fine. Or they say, you know what, there might be something here. Let's look into it more.
That gets referred to just colloquially as a 90-day finding. I know
Yes.
that's that when I first entered the space got thrown around. So that's the positive or negative 90-day finding is whether they think you have enough evidence.
And 90 days, not 3 months, colloquially.
Yeah.
So in this longer analysis, they look at 5 factors to determine whether a threatened or endangered status is required. Present or threatened habitat destruction. Obviously, as biologists, you all know that is the main driver of extinction. Overutilization, for example, hunting or fishing. Not necessarily a major issue with a lot of terrestrial species, though some marine species, obviously as either bycatch or harvest, are overutilized. Disease or predation, inadequacy of existing regulatory mechanisms. So if the species is under threat, but there are already laws protecting it, if there's state initiatives to protect it, if the species a lot of the species is on federal land and there's federal agencies have a lot of discretion to protect it, it might not get listed because of that. Other natural man-made factors, just to fill in the blank of whatever else might be out there harming species. Next one. So 3 possible answers after looking at that 5-factor analysis. 1, listing is not warranted. It is not under threat of extinction, and it's not going to be under threat of extinction in the foreseeable future, in the service's opinion. Next one. The listing is warranted. In that case, the service issues a proposed rule, receives public comments, and comes to a final listing rule or decision. That's all done under those APA requirements that we talked about. The third one is listing is warranted but precluded. This happens fairly frequently, unfortunately. The service might decide, you know what, this species really should be designated threatened or endangered, but we don't have the resources to handle that right now. There are other species we're working on that take precedent, that are higher priority, that are more at risk. In which case, they're added to what's called the candidate list, they're given priority numbers, and they're periodically reviewed. So they're not allowed to ignore the list, they have to revisit it every once in a while and analyze the species, decide whether they should take the actions necessary to list it at that time.
Andrew, we got one question that was good, I thought, to clarify, which is when we say the service or the services,
right?
Should have paused here to specify that the ESA is implemented by the Fish and Wildlife Service and the NOAA Fisheries or National Marine Fisheries Service. So we refer to those colloquially as the services. And the division of work there is terrestrial and freshwater species are covered by Fish and Wildlife, whereas marine and anadromous are covered by NIMS or Thank you for that question.
There's a joint authority, say sea turtles, because they're out in ocean and they come up on land. So yeah, when we say service, we mean either one, depending on the species we're looking at.
Yep. And so this brings us to another example. We just went through the listing process, and hopefully folks keyed in on the places where we have those little scientist icons to indicate where scientists can contribute. And listing decisions, I think, for me are, one of the ways I was most familiar with that scientists could impact the Endangered Species Act protections. And so a quick example of how that worked in recent history is with the dune sagebrush lizard, which is a species of lizard that is native to the Southwest, eastern New Mexico, and West Texas, which is really unfortunate for the lizard because that's also one of the most highly developed parts of North America for oil and gas extraction. This is a satellite image you're looking at here, and all those tiny pockmarks on the landscape are well pads for drilling for oil and gas. And so sagebrush lizard habitat has been historically subjected to high levels of destruction. There were some agreements in place to minimize the threats from that destruction, which we're actually going to circle back to at the end of the seminar. But for now, probably about 2 years ago, we got tipped off that there was a new form of development moving in. And so we used, again, satellite imagery to try to detect changes to the lizard's habitat on a month-to-month basis, so over time. So here's like a before image. Here's an after image. And if you're sharp, you'll see that there's some new bright yellow spots, bare sand appearing. And we were able to analyze those differences and see that these giant features on the landscape that are, kilometer and a half wide, called sand mines, were appearing. And this is something that had not been accounted for in the state level protections for the lizard. So we were able to use this information, use this data. We tracked, how many sand mines were appearing, how much area they covered over time, and submitted this information with other conservation organizations to the Fish and Wildlife Service in the form of a listing petition. And so more recently, actually earlier this month, we got a positive 90-day finding. You will note that we submitted this back in, what was it, 2019, early 2019, I think. And that 90-day finding just happened in July of 2020. So those timeline guidances are often exceeded and should be taken with a grain of salt. But this is a positive step for the lizard because it means the service is now going to do a complete analysis to see whether it should be protected under the ESA. So, are there any questions on the listing process? If not, I will dive into another important component, which is Section 7. Fantastic. So listing, we do have one question maybe, let's see. Come on, so we have the question about, we put the scientist logo next to the public portion of a couple of graphics. And the question is, do we think that scientists can leverage professional expertise in a specific way, or that scientists may simply be good at submitting comment? My 2 cents would be that scientists, I think, are well positioned to submit uniquely informative or hard to ignore comments. So any member of the public can submit their opinion on a potential rulemaking, but scientists can potentially provide unique and maybe novel data and analyses and research to weigh in on the subject. And often when that's part of the record, it becomes harder for the service to ignore or an agency to ignore. Awesome. So Section 7 is a part of the ESA that I think perhaps folks don't think about as much as listing, getting species on the list, but it is perhaps the largest and one of the most important programs under the ESA. And it has to do with federal consultation. So this gets at the requirement that federal agencies under the Endangered Species Act are required to conserve and protect imperiled species that are on the endangered species list. And the way that they do that typically is they will consult with the services, either Fish and Wildlife Service or National Marine Fisheries Service, on any action that they plan to take that may affect a listed species or its critical habitat. And so again, here we come up against this concept of agencies defining actions. I think similar to NEPA, that they have some discretion in doing that. There's no hard and fast rule for what constitutes an action, but I should note that an action does encompass a project that is using federal funds. So even if a private or state entity, let's say, is gonna, I don't know, develop like a bunch of residential housing, if they're getting funding from a federal agency, like Housing and Urban Development, that then counts as a federal action and is subject to this consultation process. And so the consultation process is a little bit nuanced and complicated. The big picture is the agency has to evaluate the potential impacts of its action and basically get Fish and Wildlife Service or NIMS to sign off and say, yep, this is okay from the perspective of not jeopardizing the existence of a listed species. So I'm gonna repeat that because I think it bears repeating, that the threshold here is an action cannot jeopardize the existence of a listed species. So some harm can come to individuals, but as long as the species itself is not being jeopardized by the action, that's what the agency has to make sure does not occur. I'm seeing a chat pop up here. Okay. So the basic workflow here that this graphic illustrates is an agency is going to propose an action. So to use a familiar example, let's say the Forest Service wants to propose a logging project. The agency itself gets to determine whether or not they think that action is going to affect or will not affect any listed species. No effect, there's no listed species there, it proceeds, no problem under the ESA. If it may affect, then the agency, in this case the Forest Service, will determine itself whether that action is likely to adversely affect or not likely to adversely affect listed species, LAA or NLAA. And this is done in conjunction often with one of the services in a process called informal consultation. And only if it is determined that the action is going to affect a listed species and is likely to adversely affect that listed species, formal consultation occurs in which Fish and Wildlife Service or NIMS determines whether the action is going to jeopardize or not jeopardize the species. So there are a lot of steps there, and the agency, as you can see early on, has some discretion. And there are also a lot of distinctions here: NLAA, likely to adversely affect versus not likely, jeopardy, no jeopardy even, where the criteria that are used to make those distinctions are sometimes subjective and open to interpretation. And so what comes out of that process at the end is a biological opinion. If the action has proceeded all the way to a formal consultation in which that jeopardy, no jeopardy decision is being made, the service will issue a biological opinion saying whether or not it thinks the action will jeopardize the species or not. So if the service determines that the action is not going to jeopardize it, the action can proceed. The service can recommend reasonable and prudent measures. The agency gets basically coverage for any species it might harm, and they go on their way. If the service determines that the action is likely to jeopardize the species, that does not stop the action. The action can still proceed as long as the agency adopts reasonable and prudent alternatives, RPAs, and the action can continue. So I think that's a really important distinction to make. The ESA sometimes gets held up as this onerous process that prevents a lot of development. But it's important to note that even if the most extreme and restrictive outcome is reached, which is a jeopardy determination, the actions can still proceed.
Mike,
yeah.
Are there reasonable and prudent alternatives? Is that mitigation to reduce the threat, or is that an alternative to the development? Like you have to have a different type of mine?
It can be both. So it can both include like minimization and avoidance. So, you know, log over here rather than in this particularly sensitive patch. And it can also include mitigation to offset anticipated losses. Good question. The services are in fact the only agencies that can issue a biological opinion, I believe. That was one question we got.
Yes,
Yeah.
they come from the service.
RPAs, does there have to be evidence that the mitigation works?
Yeah, so you can't completely mitigate your way out of jeopardy or adverse modification. You have to take avoidance measures to get your impact to the species below the threshold of what is jeopardizing the species. Also saw what is the definition of jeopardize? That means to appreciably reduce both the probability of survival and recovery of listed species, which is a really tough definition. For one thing, if it has this both survival and recovery. Well, if you impinge on just the if you make it so you can't recover a species, but you still aren't harming its survival, then you've met the standard because it's a both recovery and survival standard. So it's a superfluous definition in some ways, and it raises the bar of how bad an action can be. Yep, and Andrew just answered the cumulative impacts analysis. And cumulative impacts is part of ESA, but the ESA definition of cumulative impacts is different than under NEPA. Under the ESA and under Section 7, cumulative impacts only considers the future non-federal actions that are going to impact the species, or that may be reasonably expected to impact the species, on the assumption that any future federal action would undergo consultation. So you discount future federal actions because you're basically kicking the can down the road, and you will cover that sometime later. So it's weird, and it's a little problematic. Sorry to jump in there.
No, that was all important clarification. Thanks, Jacob. So we talked about, yeah, listing and Section 7 consultation are sort of two of the main opportunities for engagement from scientists, but there are also several other provisions that we just wanted to raise folks' awareness of because they also provide opportunities for and require in some cases scientific input. I think I hand it back to Andrew here.
We're not going to get too much detail. We can talk all day about the ESA. There's a few other provisions related to listing that are kind of important to know. One is critical habitat designation. So at the time of listing, services are supposed to also designate critical habitat. That is habitat that is essential to the species. A critical habitat designation means that when federal agencies take some action that modifies that critical habitat, they have to do the consultation. Sorry, let me pull my notes. 5-year reviews. If a species is listed as threatened or endangered, there has to be a review every 5 years of the scientific literature to kind of keep an eye on the species, to monitor it. Those notices of those reviews are published in the Federal Register, so that's a great opportunity if this is a species that you work on. When you see that notice, you can send, your latest review paper, even if it's not published. You can send information that you think is important that might not be common knowledge, that the service biologist might not be aware of. And finally, recovery plans are developed to, as they're what they sound like, move the species towards recovery. They are non-binding, so the services can designate a species as recovered even if it hasn't met all the requirements of the recovery plan. So this is a very, important to this crowd, we hope, and that's the best available science directives under the ESA. The ESA is unusual, and that's one of the few laws that has an explicit best available science directive for a few of its provisions. Listing decisions. Listing listing determinations are made based on best available scientific and commercial data available. What that means is you can't make a listing decision based on economic factors. You can't say, well, we're not going to list because that's going to destroy the logging industry in this forest. You have to rely solely on the best scientific and commercial data. Commercial data would be something like fisheries data. Critical habitat designations also must be made using the best scientific data available. For critical habitat designations, you can exclude areas that would otherwise be critical habitat if there's economic or national security concerns or other concerns. It's a little bit more flexible than the listing decision. Recovery plans, the ESA doesn't require them to use best available science, but they must use objective measurable criteria, which I think implicitly suggests best available science. In consultation, the agencies are required to fulfill their responsibilities using the best scientific and commercial data available. That means when an agency is considering whether an action might impact a listed species, they can't just say, nah, we don't think so. They have to use the best scientific and commercial data available to make that determination. And you can challenge them on that if they don't. Big part of this intersects with the APA. When agencies fail to follow these best available science directives, this could be considered arbitrary and capricious under the EPA. This offers a massively important role to scientists, to biologists, to people who work on the species and the habitats that the ESA deals with. Oh, also, yeah, just this footnote, just want to note that biological opinions are not usually published and open for public comment. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're part of NEPA documents or they're jammed together. And when the NEPA document's released, the BIOP is also released. That is a problem. So if you're going to challenge a biological opinion, you often have to wait until it's been issued already, and then you file a lawsuit.
Biological opinions, just as a reminder, are the outcome of the consultation. They're the final document produced by the services.
So this is going to be our next discussion group. What is best available science? How can you provide it? And how could this standard be improved?
So yeah, a couple parameters here. What is best available science? That sounds maybe obvious. What I think I want to point out with that is a bit of a spoiler. It is not just restricted to peer-reviewed literature. For our academic colleagues, it does not have to be a peer-reviewed study. So that opens up, I think, the second question of how can we think about other ways, other avenues to provide the best available science. And then something that's also helpful to think about in terms of how this mandate affects the quality of analysis that goes into all things ESA is, can we think about what does best available science actually mean, and how could you phrase that, or how could you make the requirement different, that it would be meet maybe a higher threshold for the rigor of data and analysis that contributes to these processes. So let's start with start with the first one. If folks have either some, I'm actually interested, I suspect some folks might have experience providing best available science, or if not, what are some avenues that we can think about besides, peer-reviewed publications is one. Are there others that come to mind in folks' work?
Sorry, is this big group discussion or breakouts?
We'll do big group discussion. So we have a suggestion here. Gray papers, reports to Fish and Wildlife Service, state agencies, technical reports, gray literature. Yep. So that's something that is a totally valid avenue and something that we at Defenders do. We're a big fan of preprints, which if it's available, it constitutes best available science. We got a suggestion here, unpublished masters and PhDs, meta-analyses. There's a question, would they take unpublished data or local knowledge? That's a good question.
I think so, if that's the best available science. I've seen, not frequently, but references to personal communications in some regulatory documents. So if you have, 3 populations of a species that might be at risk and you only have data on 2, but someone who works on the 3rd just tells you, yeah, you know what, I've seen a lot fewer of those. It might not be dispositive, it might not be something you're gonna base too much on, but it's something you could incorporate into your analysis.
Got some other questions. Oh, a question, how do they deal with disagreements in the published literature? Subspecies designations, for example. This actually gets at the second discussion question. Actually, both of these questions, these are really good. So the question of how do you deal with disagreements in the literature, and is data ever collected as part of an assessment, such as for a listing decision or consultation? The answer to the second question, is data collected? It is not required as the mandate is phrased, right? So best available science implies or states you can rely on just that which is available at the time. So I would pose that question, the second question then to the group. We think about this a little bit. How might you think about changing the wording or the phrasing of that standard, best available science, to potentially require new data? So we could throw them in the chat or pipe in, like folks can propose another like phrase. So instead of using the best available science, let's say the services are required to use blank.
So is the best available science like it needs to be used by agency staff? It's like Forest Service biologists or somebody like that? Or is it going to some decision-making body and external people are weighing in with written submissions?
Can you say again?
I'm a little unclear on in the American example, who is using the best available science? Are we trying to make sure that Forest Service staff are using the best available science in their preparation of a document? Or is it that some decision-making body has all the information available to them?
Right, so in this case, in the context of the Endangered Species Act, it is the Fish and Wildlife Service or National Marine Fisheries Service, whichever agency is acting as the decision maker. So they're playing both roles. like in the case of deciding to list a species or not, the agency, the biologists need to use the best available science in making that decision.
Okay, so holding them accountable to use all the information and the best information and interpret it right. Okay.
So we have a suggestion here about, right, it's a tricky question because there's never enough science, and then a suggestion that or maybe a question, do open access databases like eBird, eMammal, the state natural heritage programs count because they're not summarized, but they're sort of raw and unstructured? So I don't know that eBird records, for instance, just in and of themselves would satisfy the best available science requirement, unless that was all that was available for a species.
Yeah, but the databases, I think they can be used, again, if the best available science. But, you know, the service is going to weight what's out there based on how reliable they think it is. So, you know, while they might not need peer-reviewed science, they're usually going to place more emphasis on it. They're going to trust it a little bit more. But sometimes, you know, especially for really obscure species or species that not many people are working on, you know, it's the best what you can get. I believe Nissa asked a question about whether traditional ecological knowledge. I just want to answer. It's used. Fish and Wildlife Service, for example, explicitly recognizes that TEK can be a valuable input into the process. I don't know how common it is used. Fortunately, I think it's being used more and more, but I still think services probably don't look at it as much as they should.
So yeah, I think this discussion, this exercise highlights kind of the soft boundaries around best available science. In some ways it's quite clear, and in some ways it can either include or exclude a variety of different resources. And yeah, takeaways I think from my perspective are, it doesn't have to be peer reviewed, and we've been talking about a lot of alternative sources. And it also doesn't create any sort of standard about the quality of the science. So there were some questions about whether new data needs to be collected, how you settle disputes about taxonomy, for instance. There's no requirement that outstanding questions like that be clarified or that new data be collected. It's just whatever the service deems the best available out there. And so that can leave some room for interpretation.
I think, I should say, Rebecca, I think hit on an important point, like how do you improve that? One way might be to require data collection if there isn't an available data. Instead of the service being able to say, well, we'll just look at what's out there, they have to actually go out and collect data to inform their decisions.
I have a quick question. So does that mean that if there's not enough available data out there and more data collection would be helpful, and so they use the best available data, get shot down, that means that, you know, you'd end up having to go out there and get more available data and then resubmit everything again, which would then take longer for any sort of thing to happen.
Are you asking if there's the best available science is not good enough?
Right.
Makes them have to go out?
Like instead of, you know, right now they don't require more data to be collected. And because of that, it just slows down the entire process because things will then get shut down and it won't happen. And then that inspires more data collection when there's funds available for that species.
Yeah, that would be great. Unfortunately, there aren't funds available in
Right.
cases. Fish and Wildlife Service and NIMS are dramatically underfunded. Another alternative is if you're not sure, err on the side of being protective. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen as much as it probably should. So a lot of times lack of data will just be used as justification not to list the species or not to, you know.
Okay, so like having that,
decision.
so then therefore, right, having that provision in for like if we wanted to change it, then having that provision in for gathering more data when it's required would be highly beneficial.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Okay.
Good
All
idea.
right. Just making sure. Thanks.
And come full circle to some of the things that we were talking about earlier. We might think about where that provision could be amended. So all the parts of the ESA that were specifying the best available science many of them were in the law itself, but some of those things can be defined in regulations too. So there's different ways that one might approach trying to raise the bar for best available science. We have about, I think, an hour left scheduled, which is good. So I want to touch quickly on some of those habitat planning laws. We're going to, I think, skip over the Marine Mammal Protection Act. Apologies to those that were really hankering to talk about some marine mammals. But I do want to touch on, make sure we cover this other class of laws. We'll do that pretty quickly and then save some time for a breakout group activity where folks are hopefully synthesizing what we talked about to think about how their own work or research might be shaped to contribute to any of these conservation policies. So with that, Andrew, ready to jump into, what are we at, NIFMA?
Sure. So we refer to these as habitat management acts. It's a little bit, I don't know if we might be going a little too far in the sense that these are laws. National Forest Management Act is a law to manage the country's forests. It is designed for multiple use. It is, so it's not just about protecting, conserving natural habitats. It's also about exploiting natural forests for timber mostly. That said, the Forest Service is expected to maintain this natural resource, sustainably, to implement some conservation measures and to meet the requirements of the United States in perpetuity. We're just going to go briefly over some of the main provisions. The big one is to develop comprehensive land and resource management plans for each of these NFS units, each little forested area. Before they do that, they want to, the Forest Service has to develop a forest planning rule that sets the parameters for how this management plan is going to, these management plans are going to be created, how they're going to be implemented. The Forest Service is required to provide for the diversity in animal communities, but it does have to meet those multiple use objectives. So you can challenge an act if it's going too far in terms of ecological destruction, but you can't really do it just because they're logging someplace that you don't want them to be. Fortunately, both individual unit management plans and these overall forest planning rules are subject to public comment. It's a great opportunity to input in areas where you have knowledge. And though there's no best available science requirement in the law itself, the current forest planning rule that covers the development of each of the individual management plans does require best available scientific information. So if they don't incorporate that, they can be challenged when they're coming up with these management plans. All right.
And we've got the link just quickly to highlight at the bottom there to the Forest Service website that provides both the current planning rule and is also a portal to track upcoming forest management plans. So this is anytime the service is developing a plan for one of the parcels they manage, one of the national forests, it'll be shared and published at that website. So it's a way to see what's coming up and where there may be opportunities to provide analysis and public comment.
All right. You go to the next.
Yep. Move on to FLIPMA.
So National Forest Management Act covers U.S. Forest Service lands. On the flip side, you have FLIPMA, which manages BLM lands, the Bureau of Land Management. BLM is a massive owner of property in the United States. Huge chunks of the West especially are owned by the Bureau of Land Management. And they're and like the Forest Management Act, the Federal Land Policy Management Act looks at multiple use. Go to next slide. So what does FLPMA require? Create an inventory of all public lands and their resources and how you can use them. Develop and revise land use plans similar to NIFMA. Management should be on the basis of multiple use and sustained yield. So you want to allow multiple use. BLM lands, you can go camping on them. You don't have to ask for permission, most of them. You can go hiking, you can go hunting, you can go fishing. But you can also apply to drill oil or graze your cattle, things like that. Their priority should be given to designating areas of critical environmental concern. You don't want to let multiple use in some areas where it's just too environmentally sensitive. And federal lands must be managed to ensure the land's scientific, scenic, historical, environmental, ecological, and archaeological value. Like, as with the ESA, extends, is a statement of the values of the United States that wildlife has aesthetic, historical, cultural, ecological value. Federal lands do too. So when you're doing these analyses of federal BLM actions, in many cases, you want to look at, archaeological value, environmental value, historical value, things like that. And that can, I think this is a mostly biologist audience, but that can also bring in anthropologists and archaeologists. And that's it for FLPMA that we're going to talk about today. Go to the next slide. So this is just one really important point that applies to everything we've been talking about. Frequently, a major agency action must require multiple analyses. So I threw up some examples here for the Flathead National Forest. So you have the land management plan. You have to use, follow the NIFMA for that. You have a NEPA analysis, an environmental impact statement. You have to follow NEPA for that. And you have a Section 7 consultation, looking under the ESA, looking at endangered species. In many cases, you're going to be repeating the same analysis, but you still have to do it. Each of these requirements, they look at slightly different things. Sometimes you'll see documents combined. Sometimes you'll have environmental impact statement and a Section 7 consultation biological opinion in the same document. But you have to meet the requirements of each law. There have been some Congress people who are pushing to have kind of a unified approval process. That would probably, from a conservation perspective, not be a great idea. Because like I said, each of these laws looks at something slightly different.
So yeah, the next set of slides here are all some summary, I think, of what we've covered with a few additional information. And this is in preparation for the activity that we hope folks will participate in. We can share these slides after the fact, so you can use this for reference, but basically it can be helpful to sort of go over everything that we covered today, all the several different laws, the agencies that implement them, their main purpose, and then the different processes and ways by which scientists may contribute to those. So this is not exhaustive by any stretch of the imagination. There's several laws on here that are not on this table, but this kind of concisely summarizes most of what we've gone over today, as well as just wanted to review, focus on the top half for now of these opportunities. So as we've talked about different laws, hopefully folks have picked up on the fact that there are some recurring themes in terms of ways that we can, as scientists, inject scientific information into conservation, one of which is through this public comment process. So there are a bunch of different laws, FLPMA, NIFMA, NEPA, that all have public comment periods. And so that's a built-in mechanism to provide science that agencies have to at least respond to. You can also do that in informal comments to letters and agencies. There's listing petitions under the ESA. What else have we touched on already? So the other one that I wanted to, the other avenue that we haven't touched on that's not law specific, is there is a role, I think, for folks with scientific training to engage in what we think of as the science of policy. And so these are opportunities not only to provide some scientific input on like the content of a decision or a law, but to actually do science evaluating some component of the law's functioning in general. And this sounds like a very meta concept, and I guess it kind of is. So I'll illustrate with one example that we recently conducted at Defenders. So I had mentioned the very seemingly complicated and sometimes convoluted process of Section 7 consultation. As a reminder, the graphic that's up there is illustrating this process by which federal agencies work with, in this case, National Marine Fisheries Service or Fish and Wildlife Service, to decide whether their actions that they have planned are going to potentially jeopardize listed species. There's all sorts of questions about, you know, at a comprehensive level, how effective this law or this policy is. Is it efficient? Is it effective? Are there rooms for improvement? And so we actually were able to ask some of those questions based on data that we had about how those consultations were conducted. And so, you know, one of the interesting points that we wanted to look at is how often did NIMS in this case agree with the conclusions that federal agencies themselves were making. So if you've got an action on the table, the federal agency is going to say it thinks it will do X to a listed species, or its effect will be X. And NIMS might potentially say, nope, we think it's going to be either more or less harmful. And we thought it was interesting to look at that frequency and level of agreement and disagreement, because this determines, you know, how many resources, how many additional steps need to be put into this consultation process. And it also, we thought, illustrated the importance of having potentially an expert agency, in this case NIMS, reviewing the determinations that the agencies themselves made. At any rate, the point here is not to necessarily get into the details of this analysis, but basically that these are questions that can be asked from a scientific perspective about the way that laws are implemented themselves. And in this case, we were able to publish the findings both in a peer-reviewed paper, and we provided a web application that kind of provides an interactive look at some of the main analyses. And so this is now information that, as a nonprofit, or if you're an academic working with a nonprofit, or even able to contact lawmakers yourselves, we can put this in the hand of congressional staffers, contacts we have at the agencies, and that provides avenues for thinking about how they might want to improve implementation in the future. So I raised this leading into the activity we're about to do, just as another avenue that's not specific to a law, but another potential way that science can be used to change conservation policy. So we are going to do a breakout group activity here. This one is going to be a little longer than our previous discussions. And what we are going to ask folks to engage in, and Andrew and I will pop into the different rooms as we can, is to basically draft or come up with like a research proposal, very loosely speaking, that is aimed at improving or altering conservation outcomes for a particular species, particular habitat, or a law itself. So some of the things to identify in that, and I'll type these instructions in the chat, are to identify, you know, the question or topic being addressed, whether that's, you know, protections for habitat, protections for species, questions about how a law is functioning, identify the relevant statutes. So is there a specific law that you want to study? So let's say you are thinking about whether provisions under the NIFMA, the National Forest Management Act, are sufficiently protective to habitats. So that's a specific statute that you might want to frame your research in. What are the different processes under that statute that are going to be relevant? So is it the law itself? Do you want to do some research or provide some data ultimately that gets at a specific process or regulation? And then what is the data that might be needed? Thinking broadly and creatively here, not necessarily being limited by realities. What sort of data would you want to be able to evaluate the performance or implementation of that statute or law. So it's a very broadly framed question, and it's meant to start to get folks to think about basically how can you incorporate your areas of expertise into some of the processes that we've been going over. So if like you're a species expert, what sort of research or data on your species of interest could you provide to certain laws, certain processes that might affect how those conservation policies are carried out? So I will type a concise summary of that in the chat. We'll send folks off into breakout rooms for, let's say, 15 minutes. And I'll ask that each breakout group assign a note taker, scribe, whatever you want to call the person, because I will, when we come back, we'll ask each group to share sort of the project or scope of work that they came up with. And we can maybe get some feedback or have a discussion around that. All right, if there are no questions, let's see. We'll do 4 rooms of 4. Sounds good. All right, we'll send folks off and pop in to see how the discussion is going here shortly. Welcome back, the slow trickle, followed by a flood. Awesome. I think everybody's back. We didn't lose anyone in cyberspace, which is always a success for Zoom breakout rooms. Great. Yeah, thank you everyone for participating in that exercise. I was able to pop into 2 of the rooms. It sounded like there were some good ideas and discussions going. Hopefully it was helpful for folks to think about, yeah, how their own research or areas of interest might intersect. So I would like to, hopefully each group settled on a speaker or face of the group. If we could go around and maybe get a short 2-minute-ish summary from each group on what they were thinking about, what sort of research they wanted to undertake to help with, or to try to affect conservation policy. Yeah, interested to hear what groups were thinking, and then we can, certainly as those are shared, those are open for feedback and thoughts from everyone too. So let's start with group 4. Go bottom to top.
Who was group 4?
Group 4, yeah.
I'm coming. Hold on. Let me turn on my video. Okay, my video. Okay, there we go. Sorry, technical problems right off the bat. Hi, everybody. I'm Nissa. I'm our spokesperson for Group 4. So here we go. So our scenario was that there was going to be logging in a national forest in wolverine habitat in the Northwest US. And the statutes we thought would apply would be NEPA and the National Forest Management Act. And the target processes we thought about were what are the natural history features and the demographics that would come into play for those species. So the removal of a few individuals could have a population level impact. And we thought that where in that process that would happen would be in the public comment section of NEPA. And then if later on in the process, if it got to the legal litigation phase, we'd have to be able to connect the science with the threat and really clearly in order to litigate that properly. And so we would need good data on occupancy models, on prey, fire, and dispersal. And then we also thought of the idea of multi-use. So the National Forest Management Act has clauses in there about multi-use. And so we thought if we could do some outreach and stakeholder analysis, hunters and trappers could be brought on board, because if forest was cut, then that would impact their livelihoods and recreation. And that was it.
Cool. Yeah, I was part of that discussion, and yeah, I think the data is the idea be the research proposal, or the planned research would be to get that occupancy data to be able to really convincingly describe and present where wolverines, what habitat they're using, and so how that action is potentially affecting their habitat and likelihood of persisting in the area. Sounds like
Would you redo that analysis for both? The other one was the National Forest Management Act. So you'd be presenting it twice in two different processes. Is that right?
Well,
the second one being, is it NEPA that you guys were considering? We all were
Yeah. First NEPA and then second the other one, NIFMA or something.
NIFMA, yeah. Yeah, arguably you could use it in both places. And keeping in mind that, so under NIFMA, the lens would sort of be more along the lines of what the impacts to wolverine, like population viability would be of the action. Whereas under NEPA, you might be presenting that same information through the lens of, did the agency adequately consider everything that's out there? Like, did they do their due diligence? Like, the impact is less important. But if you can show that they didn't, then they got to start over again. Cool. Thanks, group 4. Group 3.
I don't know what group number we were. Are we group 3?
Hold on, I can see. Group 3 was, yeah, that was your group. Brenna, Rebecca, Robbie, and Teresa.
Yeah, okay. So sorry guys, I kind of hijacked it because we talked a little bit about the work I'm going to be doing, that I've just started, and that I'm going to be doing for the next couple of years, looking at how to integrate genomic data into the Endangered Species Act listing. First, we were just going to look at listing process, but we'll probably also include recovery decision making. So this is obviously not species specific, but more data specific so when we have cases where genomic data are available, what are sort of the best practices for using those data to inform decision making? So under the ESA, in terms of listing, the biggest impacts are on sort of the unit to be listed. So designating the conservation unit. So if that's a species or a subspecies or a distinct population segment or evolutionarily significant unit. So, and that genetic and genomic data inform both aspects of that, which is like how distinct is the unit, the conservation unit, and then how significant is it to the evolutionary lineage of the species. And then in terms of recovery, we can use those data to better understand adaptive capacity and potential to respond to changing conditions. So yeah, we talked a little bit, Rebecca works on bats, and bats are actually one of the case studies I was thinking of including because there's been some recent work on potential evolutionary response to white nose syndrome, which is the fungus that's been decimating bat populations. So in that case, I think it's probably less relevant to the unit delineation and more relevant to the aspect of listing, which is the extinction risk assessment. Because we can use that information to better understand extinction risk. So for example, in little brown bats, that potential to show an adaptive response to white nose could inform, both extinction risk, but then recovery planning. So yeah, that's what we talked about.
And so with that, were you talking about in the context of, it sounds like informing a listing decision and getting at one of those 5 factors, right? In this case, disease and predation, with if you have demonstrated relationships between genomic characteristics and disease risk, they argue that there's an increased threat from that 3rd factor. I guess the 3rd factor.
Yeah, yeah. I think with a lot of those bats with white nose, it's pretty easy to make a case that they're highly imperiled since we've seen such dramatic population declines.
Right.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. I don't know if anybody from my group wants to chime in.
If nobody else does, I'll say hi, Brenna.
Hi. Nice to see you again.
It's good. Yeah, it's good to talk with you again. It was pre-pandemic when we spoke, and good to see that you're hanging in there.
Yes. Yeah.
Cool. All right, that brings us to group 2, which I think the only remaining members are Jacob and Hyun.
Uh-oh. Okay, so a lot of this was actually, Karen had to step out, but a lot of it was, of our discussion was really focused on her work, the social science work that she does, and thinking about, well, how values and valuation play into policy implementation. And so a lot of it was just discussing all of the variability around that. We didn't actually meet the challenge that was put forth in coming up with a research project, but it was a lively discussion anyway. Sorry, I don't have something. I actually thought that Karen was going to be here, and since it was focused on her work, I was like, well, let her do that. Anything else?
So one of the things that came up in, I forget which room it was in, who I was talking with, was the concept of some of the voluntary conservation agreements and candidate conservation agreements. And the question was raised, like, do those work? Is there value at getting presumably buy-in from multiple stakeholders through those processes to avoid listing, but provide some voluntary options for protecting the species? And that's, like, in my mind and experience, a huge open-ended question. And you mentioned social science, Jacob. I think just, to me, when we think about like research that contributes to conservation policy, I think the knee-jerk reaction is to think about biological research, including cats. And social science is another huge perspective to bring in terms of evaluating how well these things work. So just, I can guess to flag that for folks. All right.
Yeah, I should say, as candidate conservation agreements, especially, you know, in theory, they might be a good tool. In practice, there have been a lot of issues with the ones that have come out. So
if we have time, we'll talk about one of those here in a second. But let's hear from group 1, which was Tessa, Rachel, and Brianne.
Hi, I'm Brianne. Speaking for my group. This is kind of based on a project Tessa's working on. So our topic we looked at was the golden winged warbler, which is currently listed as threatened. And so the relevant kind of legislation would be the Endangered Species Act, but because it's already listed, it would be more of like a 5-year reassessment. And then our kind of target process is gaining the best scientific information to reassess the species, determining if the listing of threatened is still the most accurate or if that should be updated. And then in terms of kind of the proposal and the data needed is looking specifically at surveying private lands where habitat restorations were already conducted to kind of gain a better idea about the species' critical habitat and the population responses to these habitat modifications to kind of understand if the recovery strategy is actually helping the species or not. And we also talked about kind of using other sources of data as well for this kind of analysis, like eBird data, National Audubon Society, or other community science initiatives. So yeah.
Yeah, the recovery process is definitely one that merits providing more scientific input into, I think, in many cases, in part because the criteria for improvement, the criteria for delisting or recovery are set at the time the species is listed, but how you go about measuring those requires really rigorous data and analysis that sometimes is not available. So that's definitely a good process to think about intervening in. Awesome. Well, I hope that was a helpful exercise. Sounds like folks are able to make some connections to their own work, which is was one of the purposes of doing the exercise, is to start to think about how things that we already have expertise in can connect to some of these maybe new concepts that we threw at everybody. So in the last 9 minutes here, we've got a few more closing sort of summary type slides to work through that are actually going to tie in some of the things that came up, I believe, in the discussion groups. So I'm going to hop back over to the presentation. And yeah, this politics and policy we wanted to touch on, and it emerged pretty naturally out of a couple of conversations that sounded like that. The big picture idea is to stay aware of the social and political context around some of these decisions. It's easy to look at the different laws and policies that we've gone over and see them in a very straightforward manner, pull on lever X to achieve outcome Y. And in theory, that should happen. In practice, as was brought up with some of the voluntary conservation agreements, that there can be political ramifications to those actions, and they may not always achieve the desired outcome. And so one example that I'll return to is the case of the dune sagebrush lizard. So I alluded to the fact that the species hadn't been listed despite all this oil and gas development when I described the situation earlier. And that's because there was a voluntary conservation agreement in place, the Texas Conservation Plan. And this provided basically rules and mechanisms by which companies could drill in certain areas as long as they avoided others, and in theory provided a compromise for continued oil and gas development and protections for the lizard. Nobody in the region wanted to see extractive practices shut down on account of a lizard species, and yet conservationists were very concerned about that species, so this provided a compromise. Basically, the long story short is, in addition to a listing petition, what our analysis revealed is that voluntary conservation agreement was wholly inadequate to really prevent this new class of threat, those sand mines that I mentioned. And so in addition to petitioning to list the species, we also worked with the Texas comptroller to try to re-envision the conservation agreement. And so that is an ongoing process right now that, in parallel to considering listing the lizard, I believe Fish and Wildlife Service is also contemplating a new proposed voluntary conservation agreement that I don't think they've actually disclosed who put it forth, which is kind of sketchy, to use a scientific term. But this case really illustrates how, in theory, using this voluntary conservation agreement path provides some really appealing avenues in terms of compromise and getting stakeholders on board, especially in an area like West Texas where economic considerations are so strong. So it's all to illustrate that sort of the socio-political landscape can be important in thinking about which levers one wants to pull on to achieve conservation outcomes. The other two elements we wanted to quickly hit on, we've talked a lot about engaging in rulemaking processes and suing agencies potentially after they've done something that is not in accordance with their mandates. And we sort of ignored the scientist at the top of this graph here, the initiating event. There is a role for scientists to play in shaping laws in the first place, or helping to direct where Congress is thinking in terms of the legislation that it's going to introduce. And so we wanted to touch on briefly a couple other, not necessarily statute specific options, but ways that scientists can provide to shape the discussion from the get-go. And so one of those opportunities Jacob has experience with and can share a little bit with us about congressional testimony.
Yeah, so like Mike said, there are many different options. And as I think everyone here knows, conservation biology is really a crisis-driven field. We're often behind the curve, behind the ball, trying to react to things. And that's a lot of what we've been talking about today, is how we can input as a process is already underway. It's really important to remember that the lawmakers and decision makers who shape the playing field need to, and they really want to, except for the crazy ones. They don't want to hear from scientists, but most of them aren't crazy, and they need and want to hear from scientists to help them know where to go. Testifying in front of Congress, testifying in front of state legislatures, testifying in court, serving as an expert witness. These are all ways that you can be involved, and especially when it's to lawmakers or to policymakers, it's a way to help set the terms of the discussion, to let people know what the state of the biodiversity crisis is, to help them understand that there are steps that they can take to make to change the course of outcomes, to change the course of conservation. Here are just a couple of examples of one testifying on the IPAS report, the global assessment that came out last year to the House Natural Resources Committee, letting lawmakers know that this is a big deal is part of what we can do as scientists, and inject ourselves early on, let them know there's a problem to be addressed. The second example is testifying to appropriations. We need more money for conservation. It's less than a drop in a bucket what we get these days. And so outlining what can be done, letting them know up front, here, put the money up there, and then folks across in the field, across the nation can put it to use, is a really important part. Another part is the publication part. Is this last week? No, it's 2 weeks ago. We put out a white paper, a report from Defenders, outlining guidance to decision makers on getting to 30 by 30. That is protecting 30% of terrestrial and marine ecosystems by 2030. It was important for us to get this out because this topic, this idea, 30 by 30, is very hot and growing now. And in order to shape the discussion and help lawmakers and decision makers, the public, also know that this is possible, we want to make sure that the science is relevant and timely, and we get it to the right audiences. We're about to submit a manuscript for review in a journal, like what many scientists do. In this case, we wanted to get this in the hands of senators and U.S. senators and representatives who will be pushing and making the decisions on getting the U.S. to adopt a 30 by 30 goal, a national goal. And so a report worked. And doing the outreach was really important. Having the connections to get the report to the right people was really important. So as you're doing your science and you're thinking about, well, I want my science to inform the discussion, think about how getting it out early, knowing what the landscape is like in terms of what people are listening to, can be critically important. And this is an opportunity to have your voice be heard.
Thanks, Jacob. So yeah, those both examples build on this list of opportunities that I shared earlier, along with a couple other ones that we didn't get a chance to touch on. But yeah, as I mentioned, we'll share these slides and hopefully this can be a reference point for folks if you're trying to remember all the different ways that you can use your expertise. So going to skip over for you. Sorry, Andrew. And jump right to, so wrapping this up basically, because we're right at 4 o'clock. I know this has been a long session. I wanted to leave folks with resources for information on the different processes and some sources of data that we've discussed. So we mentioned the Federal Register is a place that you can track all the rulemakings and things that the different agencies are coming out with. Office of Information Regulatory Affairs is a similar sort of government warehouse for procedural documentation. The two sources of data that we didn't touch on before, but were alluded to, are the NOAA has a fisheries public consultation tracking system. It is from this database that we actually got all our data on Section 7 consultations. So they record time, the species, the action, the agency, a lot of the data around what's going on with every consultation that they conduct, and that's publicly accessible. Fish and Wildlife Service is updating their database, but they have ECOS, which provides a lot of data on species that are listed. There are some consultation biological opinions up there. It's not a comprehensive warehouse, although they're moving in that direction. And each species will have a fairly good set of documentations, of documents showing all the different federal decisions that were made in its history. So listing decisions, 5-year reviews, all those types of things related to the Endangered Species Act as administered by Fish and Wildlife Service. And then the two others that we shared on the relevant slides, the Bureau of Land Management and Forest Service both provide website portals to their planning processes. So if you want to stay abreast of new rules that are coming down, management plans for particular parcels, you can check in with those websites to make sure you know what each of those agencies is up to and how they're analyzing the impacts of their actions. So that is all that we have in terms of materials. If there's any outstanding questions, I know I'm able to stick around and try to field any of those that I can. Otherwise, yeah, open up for questions, comments, or if folks want to get the heck out of Dodge at 4 o'clock Eastern time on a Friday, that's also understandable.